when we look at what we've looked at so far, you can see the power that evidence-based parenting can bring. Can we turn now to what more we then need to do to support the families we're talking about? And I guess, I'd urge you to consider this across research, policy, practice, training, even cultural change. And Matt, while I've got you, I guess the first question there, when we're talking about the evidence, you said in your opening statement that policy investments need to be based on strong evidence. Any idea of how much public money is spent on evidence-based parenting programs now? How is that tracked?
Well, boy, what a question you've asked there. If we knew, we would be absolutely talking about it a lot. The problem is that most governments don't actually report data on how much money is spent on parenting programs, or particularly on evidence-based parenting programs. Whereas in other areas of public health, we know pretty clearly how much is spent on, prevention of smoking and, promotion of physical activity and nutrition and so on. If you try to find out how much money any government is spending on this, it's virtually impossible. Therefore, there's no accountability. I've never heard any political party go to an election talking about what they're doing for parenting. They might talk about what they're doing for parents in terms of economic kind of issues, or broader lip service to families. But the whole idea of increasing access to high quality, culturally informed, evidence-based parenting programs doesn't get on the radar screen of public policy discourse, and it should.
Okay, let's come back to that in just a moment. But Sophie, are you agreeing with what Matt is saying?
Yes, and it's interesting. We've recently, as part of our Parent and Family Research Alliance group, we've conducted a review of research on evidence-based parenting programs in Australia from NHMRC and ARC, finding that only about 0.25% of the total research budget goes to evidence-based parenting programs, which is pretty interesting given parenting impacts such a wide range of child outcomes, and it has one of the most powerful impacts. So for treating anxiety, depression, obesity, health-related, parenting is often central, and yet we put so little money into the research. So that might give some indication of the value, perhaps, to evidence-based parenting, both in research, but what about in practice, as Matt's saying? I think it flows on then to how well are these actually used in the public sphere.
Yeah, and it ignores that long-term impact, I guess. Sarah, you've been sitting there quietly, and I want to come to you because you've done some wonderful research into how nudge can be used successfully here. And you gave us the idea of the stamp collection and reducing the buffet-sized meal in your introduction. Give us another example of how nudge can be used in a broader policy sense.
So you change something and a person reacts. And there is not necessarily any deep cognitive processing or any learning or anything accompanying that. So you could say, well, that's kind of just cheap behavioral change. We don't want to engage in that, right? Or you could say, in some contexts, that's the only chance I have. A powerful example is organ donation. So in countries where organ donation is the default, so the country says every person in this country is an organ donor, except if they say, I don't want to be. In such countries, organ donation rate is 99%. In countries where the nation says, well, by default, you're not an organ donor, but if you would like to be, then you can opt in. The organ donation rate is 12%. Now, this is not impacting on people's free will. Everyone is free to either opt in or to opt out. But the way we set up structures has huge consequences on behavior. And I actually, the more I've been thinking about, the stamp experiment and how my work links in with families and with children, the more I'm seeing that if we can do smart nudges, they, especially at family level, they could become powerful triggers of habits that become lifelong habits. Because sometimes what it takes is that one change, right? That one impetus that creates something, and then potentially that can carry on.
And I wonder if one of those is another example you've given me, and that is when you go and stay at hotel accommodation, now you've got to actively ask for your sheets to be changed or your towels to be washed. If children are seeing that, are they then learning this is a way that they can help climate change. They can help the planet.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I would go a step further. I would go as far as to say that I would hope my children would be confused if the hotel would clean the room every day by default, because it's hugely environmentally unfriendly. It's totally unnecessary. So the aim would not be that they make a choice. The aim would be that if the norm is unsustainable, or if the norm is violence, or if the norm is gender inequity, our children should be sitting there in disbelief, thinking what went wrong here, because that is not the norm I have been taught. That is not the norm I've grown up with. And actually, I'm going to stand up and say, no, that norm's not okay.
Thank you. Terrific there. And Daryl, can I jump to you? Based on this, nudge seems one way of delivering evidence-based parenting. What do you think is the best way broadly to deliver these programs to families?
Yeah, well, interesting. I was just reflecting on what Sarah was saying and connecting it back to the earlier conversation that a lot of the investment that we have in parenting supports is actually through the statutory child protection system, which, as I said before, is way too little and way too late. And so if we've got those kind of structural issues that Sarah was saying, that the default is get parents the supports that they need. So the default is that you engage somehow with parenting advice, just as the default is that you go along to an antenatal class and learn about the birthing process. We need to be following that through and have the default to be seen as accessing support. So it's normative. The people down the road who are new parents are also doing that. The people down the road who are, sending their kids to school, are engaging with developmentally appropriate parenting supports right throughout the life course. If that was the norm, I think we would be doing a lot better.
Donna, what are you thinking here?
We all do amazing research, I think, in focusing on ways to support families, but we're really limited in how we get that information to families. Obviously, there's synchronous and non-synchronous. We can have people come in and we run trainings, or we can provide stuff on the web that they can go and learn, and that's great, but they have to make the time for it. But what if we made a change in the moment, that we were gently reminding them in the moment and nudging them accordingly? And I agree with Sarah that doesn't lead to long-term change necessarily, but if it's triggers, and it's the right triggers to set and cue them to behaviours and actions, then that can make an enormous difference. So we applied that in the development of this app that I mentioned called Bright Tomorrows, to test whether we could take the most current evidence around brain building and supporting families to develop those outcomes in their children, if we could structure nudges so that we made sure we were prompting parents in all the areas that they needed to be thinking about without them realizing they're even doing it. And what was really valuable about this nudge theory that we applied was that the nudges were way more effective when we included a little bit of science with them. So while the nudge is 2 sentences that might remind parents of the value of blowing bubbles when children are feeling very, very anxious, or reminding parents that driving in the car, picking out the number 7 while they're moving around teaches children basic numeracy, what it also does, it tells them why. And we thought if we just include the science in there, again, very simply presented lay language, maybe parents would look at that science and it would embed the trigger so that they would react on it and even advocate for it themselves. So we have something called Brainy Background. So each time a parent gets a trigger, like here are some things that you can do to narrate your work so children are getting words and language, it will tell them why that's important. Why is peekaboo such a terrific activity for children? And that explanation. So we get parents to become advocates and share. They too are translating that knowledge, and hopefully with a really solid evidence base. So I love nudge theory.
Matt, what did you want to say here?
So you need a variety of interventions that will support and sustain early learning. But the whole idea of you don't do a parenting program and it's all over with. We need a system that enables repeated re-engagement at differing levels of support. And I mean, I'm also a fan of nudge theory to enable some of the most basic changes in parenting to be a default. And I think a default should be that every parent is given the opportunity to access a high quality evidence-based parenting program. And we really need to push that.